I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS, where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm Evan Brown, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. Today, we discuss the Trump administration's latest deals with respect to AI chips going to China, and we also get into the growing list of Section 232 investigations and where they all may be headed. All this and more on The Trade Guys. Okay, welcome back to The Trade Guys. Congress may be on vacation, but we are still here on what's actually been an unseasonably cool Thursday here in Washington. But of course, updates from the White House are always hot off the presses. We're going to start off talking chips, and I want to turn to a story that really jumped off the page when it was first reported, I think a little over a week ago now. So the Trump administration has struck a pretty unorthodox deal with NVIDIA and AMD, who agreed to pay up to 15% of their revenue from sales of some advanced AI GPUs to China for the right to keep exporting them there. So I know that could mean a decent bit of money flowing into the U.S. Treasury coffers, but this, of course, is also a shift in our export control strategy. So, Bill, good deal, bad deal, or too early to tell?
Well, it's being called the big shakedown by just about everybody. And I think that's an apt description, although I have to say, in theory, the policy behind it makes some sense, although I think it's being done for not entirely the right reasons. There are sort of two issues here, the national security issue and the shakedown issue. You know, the fact that for the first time certainly in export control history, companies are paying to get export licenses, which is, I think, both unconstitutional and illegal, but I'll get to that in a minute. The national security issue is actually kind of interesting, and I'm not sure that the administration is wrong in its approach, although its motivation may be not what people think. It seems right now that there's been a lot of pulling of punches going on with respect to China. I think because Trump is really obsessed with getting a one-on-one meeting with Xi Jinping, which he thinks he can then do to make a deal. He tried that in his first term and got played. As I've said before, I think he'll succeed in his second term in getting a meeting and he'll get played again. But right now, the maneuvering is all about to get the meeting. The Chinese, as always, are playing that card very carefully. And we've seen a string of things, the chip thing, which I'm going to talk about, but also slow rolling other decisions. They've extended the ceasefire on China tariffs for another 90 days, which means it'll take it past the APEC summit in October, which is, if there's going to be a meeting between the two, it'll probably be around then. So no rocking of that boat before that time period. They refused to let the president of Taiwan make a New York stop on his trip to some other countries in Central America. No rocking the boat on that one. One of our colleagues here at CSIS has speculated that one of the reasons we haven't seen a Taiwan trade agreement is that that's being slow rolled also because they don't want to rock the boat, because a lot of things are being slow rolled, I think, in order to get the meeting. And this may be another one of them, at least in terms of Trump's thinking, that why not throw the Chinese a bone, and particularly throw them a bone that he took away from them a couple of months earlier. You may recall that one of the earlier things he did in his administration was going to impose controls on exactly these chips. And keep in mind that these chips were designed specifically, both the NVIDIA ones and the AMD ones, were specifically designed to perform at a capability less than the Biden administration's export controls. And it was a classic case of what we've seen before of, you draw a line, and by doing that, you create an incentive to build below the line. And that's exactly what the companies did. They designed a product that was less capable than the line so they could sell it. And, the reality of this is that this can go on forever. The government's usual response is, well, we'll draw another line, which is what the Biden administration actually did. We'll catch them. Well, what that then leads to is the companies develop another product. It's below the line. Trump, in essence, put a stop to that initially by blocking the sale of these items. And then he reversed himself recently to let these things go. That caused a commotion in the China hawk community, who believed it was going to harm our national security. What that's really saying is that they think the Biden administration drew the line in the wrong place because, as I said, the chips were designed not to do that, not to harm our security. They were designed to be less capable than what the Biden folks had assessed as dangerous. But if you think that any chips are dangerous, which some people do, then you're upset at what the president has done. On the other hand, if they're not a threat, and if the Biden administration drew the line in the right place, which a lot of people would argue, then, who cares? The U.S. policy for years has not been don't sell them anything. It's been sell them older stuff and make sure that we run faster and stay ahead. This is older stuff in quotes. It's not old because it's a new chip, but it's less capable than the most capable stuff that we have. And in that sense, it's older. It does raise, though, a philosophical question that's been making the rounds for 40 years and not always about chips, which is it better to spend your resources running faster, or is it better spending your resources tripping the other guy, using the marathon metaphor? The China hawks, the decouplers would say, we need to stop them at all costs. And the Trump administration seems to, at least in the AI sphere, and these are AI chips, should have said that in the beginning, seems to be adopting the opposite strategy, which is flood the zone. Let's make our chips the global standard. Let's make sure everybody buys our chips, uses our technology, so that the U.S. tech stack becomes a global standard. Let's not sell the most advanced ones to China. Let's keep them behind, but let's sell them to everybody else. And so we can establish ourselves as a leader. I remember this because I gave that speech in the Clinton administration about encryption technology for the same reason. The theory being is if people are going to buy it, we'd much rather have them buy ours than somebody else's. And there's a lot of logic to that. Where the logic falls down is when Secretary Ludnick, as an example, but he's not the only one, said, we want the Chinese to be addicted to our chips. Well, that ship sailed a long time ago. The Chinese made a decision years ago to develop their own chips and their own technology, and they're busy doing that. And actually their reaction to what Trump did on these chips is to warn their own companies to be cautious in buying them, and instead they should be buying comparable Chinese chips. I mean, in a way, it's a victory from China's perspective, but it's not exactly a welcome one. But that's all the security side. I think the thing that's more worrisome is the shakedown side. There's a provision in the Constitution that says you cannot impose a fee, a tax, on exports from the states. And of course, those last three words are important because a lot of the chips in question, the NVIDIA chips, they're actually made in Taiwan and exported from Taiwan. They're subject to our controls. We don't need to get into the weeds to explain that, but they're subject to our controls. But technically, they're not exported from the states. So somebody may sue, we'll see. But in addition, there's a provision of law in the Export Control Statute, the Export Control Reform Authorization Act, or Export Control Reform Act, ECRA, that also prohibits assessing a fee for an export license. So if the administration wants to argue it's not a tax to avoid the constitutional problem, and if they want to argue it's not a fee to avoid the ECRA problem, I think the only thing that's left is that it's a donation, which I don't think anybody believes. I mean, the only way to tell if it's a donation is if they don't pay and nothing happens. And so we'll see if that happens. But what it really is, it's pay for play. It's telling companies that you pony up, visit the president, as the CEO of NVIDIA did, visit the president, bring your checkbook, and there'll be a happy ending. And that's really not, I think, the way that our national security policy should be enforced or implemented.
Scott, is this a good donation from these companies?
I think Bill's got the analysis right. And it does seem that we've got to sort out what we want from our controls. Being the dominant player in AI makes sense to me. And we have a lot of reasons to pursue that aggressively. So I'm fine with that. But the notion of charging fees for everything seems a little crass. And I think what's happening here is one of the things that the administration repeatedly celebrates is all the great revenue that's rolling in from their trade policy. And look, when you import $3 trillion a year worth of stuff and you put a 10 to 15% blanket tariff on, yeah, the money comes in. And that's not a good or a bad thing on its own. That is the effect of tariffs. But I think they like it. We brought in a couple of finance guys. The Secretary of Commerce and Secretary of Trade were both from the finance world. And if you looked at the United States as a corporate operation, there's great wealth in terms of land, labor, and capital and the assets that the country has. But we were heading to a debt crisis. So it's no wonder that these people from the world of finance would take into account the revenue side. I think they've gone too far here, and they ought to throttle it back on their own rather than wait for some court to smack them down.
The revenue point is really an important one. I think in this case, I seem to remember the rough revenue estimate on the chips in question might be $2 billion over some period of time. That assumes that the Chinese are going to buy as many as AMD and NVIDIA want to sell them, which may not happen if the Chinese government gets in the way. But there's now beginning to be speculation that the revenue effect is going to last longer than people think. I mean, one of the issues that always comes up is when you talk tariffs, is are any of these things going to last longer than Trump's presidency? Or are they all going to go away in 2029? And I think, at this point, obviously, if Republicans elected in Trump's image, they probably won't go away. He'll probably continue to do a lot of the same things. But it's not even clear if a Democrat is elected if they'll go away, because it's really easy to become addicted to the money. And it's a lot of money. And if we get rid of it in 2029, it's going to be an even bigger hole in the budget. So whatever we do may be around, not only on export controls, but on tariffs. And I don't think this administration is particularly thinking about the long term, but somebody has to.
And Scott, Reuters reported yesterday that Commerce Secretary Lutnick is also exploring the idea of the U.S. government taking an equity stake in Intel and perhaps other recipients of CHIPS Act funds. Are we just getting into the equity game now?
That's a step too far. I mean, I came from the private sector. I've seen state-owned industries up close in the Warsaw Pact countries when the Soviet Union collapsed. It's not a pretty sight, and I see zero evidence that state-owned enterprises would work any better here than they have every place else in the world. It's a really bad idea, and we're likely to buy the wrong companies and kill them with kindness and be probably worse off than we would have if we just let the programs go. So it seems to me to be a waste. I think the U.S. Chamber of Commerce put out a very comprehensive note on this. They seem to have hit most of the points, so congratulations to the Chamber. They talk about why this is, you have a lot of other ways to do this. You do not have to use this kind of state-owned enterprises that have failed everywhere else to try to make it work somehow in the U.S. I just can't see this being a particularly good idea, regardless of its news cycle value.
Well, I just can't resist pointing out that this is the Republicans that are injecting the government into private ownership of companies. Ronald Reagan is no doubt turning over in his grave, and that's all I can say on that. I think Scott makes a good point.
If they ever ask us, there's a unanimity among trade guys that this is a really dumb idea.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a dumb idea. I've always been more pro-industrial policy, I think, probably than Scott has. For one thing, I'm not a Republican, so I don't have the historic antipathy to this. Apparently, they don't either anymore. I'm not as sure that it's a bad idea, although in this particular case, I'm not sure that it's been thought through, and I'm not sure what the motivation is. It may simply be an effort to make more money somehow. If the company succeeds, the government will pick up a share, which would not be true if the government didn't own it. Usually the government is concerned about making the country better rather than making itself better. But I think there's been a number of situations in the past, the auto industry being the prime example, where the government has really saved the industry from collapse. So I wouldn't say these things are always bad or always a mistake. This particular case, I'm not sure was particularly thought through. I mean, I'm not sure there's a policy there. I think this is much more of a transactional short-term thing, like a lot of what we're seeing these days.
We'll take whatever agreement we can get on the trade, guys. So let's stick with chips just for a few more minutes. So since April, we've had Section 232, national security investigation of semiconductor imports, of course, parallel investigations into pharmaceuticals, steel and aluminum. Bill tells me wind turbines just recently, and several more.
As of today, yes.
So Scott, maybe you could start. First, can you remind us, those of us who aren't fluent in trade jargon, what exactly is a 232? And second, what's the latest on the semiconductor investigation?
Sure. This refers to Section 232 of the Trade Act of 1962. It was a section that was inserted in the Act to be able to investigate matters of a national security nature and to take action that would address the national security shortfall. It's been used for a wide range of things over the years. It's not always about the statutory authority for higher tariffs on certain sectors. I believe the first use of Section 232 was the oil sanctions on Libya in response to the Lockerbie bombing. So this goes way back to the Reagan administration. It was the authority under which the Reagan administration imposed sanctions on the Libyan oil industry. So it's had a number of uses. And while the statute's fairly old, it's been used creatively on occasion. It's not always about tariffs. And that's the thing that, for me, often is missed. There was a machine tool case, I think also late Reagan administration. I now forget the details, but basically there was a very sophisticated machine tool companies where there was both commercial and defense application to the specialized machining that happened. Most of their competitors were Japanese competitors. Sounds like the 1990s all over again. The Japanese competitors were advancing very rapidly and basically putting the U.S. industries out of business. In that case, because it was a treaty ally like Japan, and there was an opportunity to negotiate something different than just tariffs, which wouldn't probably have worked for the U.S. industry. But there was a licensing arrangement of the key technology, and there was a way to address a valid national security problem. The voluntary restraining agreement that kept the U.S. companies in the game, which I think was probably good policy. It was a good use of the statute as it was drafted. So this has been revived by the Trump administration. Steel and aluminum were the first targets in the first administration, and they continue to be a favorite. But there's a whole range of issues where, in the view of the Trump administration, the U.S. ability to produce in certain sectors is critical to our national security. And they've conducted the investigations with an eye toward taking steps to increase the likelihood that this industrial base will be in the United States. It seems they're being reasonably forthright and flexible about it, but it's quite complicated. And it gets big. What happened this week that raised my curiosity, and why I'm glad Bill's the other trade guy on the program, because of his experience in steel, because a number of items were added. And I couldn't tell whether that was important or not, but it's confusing at almost all levels.
It is important, and it raises the great unanswered issue about the new investigations that are forthcoming, which is the derivative or downstream product issue. So in the case of steel, it was one thing to say steel coming into the country is going to have a tariff on it. But the administration went farther than that and said, and also products that contain steel and aluminum are going to have a tariff put on the steel content of those products. So that potentially covered automobiles, although they're in a separate category. They have their own 232 tariff. But other steel-containing items are going to have a tariff. And what the administration did that was so far unique, but may not stay that way for very long, is to invite American companies to recommend other products to be added to the tariff list. And so what's been happening is that American companies who want to stick it to their foreign competitors have been recommending that their foreign competition that makes products that contain steel or aluminum be added to the list of items covered by these downstream tariffs. And what happened earlier this week was that the administration added 407 additional items to the list. We made some fun of this when the first list came out because it included knitting needles and crochet needles and the shovel part of the bulldozer, the curved part in the front. I made the point that I didn't really see the national security threat of knitting needles. I mean, I suppose if you were going to attempt an assassination and you wanted to bring some old lady in with her knitting who would pull out the knitting needle and stab the head of state, I could sort of theorize that. But
it needs to be an American knitting needle.
It would have to be an American needle. That's right. Don't want it to be a foreign needle. That's more the stuff of spy novels, I think, than reality.
Trotsky got it with an ice pick, right?
Well, yes. And if we look, I'll bet you ice picks are on the list.
Yes.
But you can imagine this multiplies by several orders of magnitude the coverage of these things. We're waiting to see if they do the same thing with chips because it's, right now, more than half the chips that come into this country come in, I think it's in the 50 to 60% range of chips coming into this country come in embedded in other products, laptops, desktops, phones, your toaster, Internet of Things, your refrigerator, computer operated heating systems, HVAC systems, all kinds of things. Cars, indeed. If you start saying downstream products are going to have these tariffs assessed, you end up with a whole boatload of unanswered questions. One is, are these stackable? So, for example, the car tariff now is 25%, except for Japan, Korea, and EU, where it's 15. But let's go with 25 for the moment. The car tariff is 25%. A car will contain literally hundreds of chips. Is there going to be a separate tariff on each of those chips? And if so, how much is it going to be? Is it going to be the car tariff amount, or is it going to be the 232 chip tariff amount, which Trump has said might be as high as 200%? Now, also keep in mind that the car chips tend to be lower end, and each one is not very expensive. So it's not clear what difference it would make anyway. But among other things, it would create an administrative nightmare. But then there's the stackable question. Are these tariffs going to be stacked one on top of the other? And then there's also the look-through question, which is related. So you buy an imported toaster, which is almost all of them these days, and your toaster now has a chip, which will presumably make sure your toast doesn't burn or tell you if it's about to burn or, monitor your bread levels and tell you when you're running out. And the look-through question is, so is that chip going to be charged the toaster tariff, which would be the general reciprocal tariff for that country? So say Vietnam, it would be 20%. Or is it going to be charged the tariff of the chip, or both? I've not seen anything that answers those questions. And it may not amount to a huge amount of money for the low-end chips, but it does amount to an administrative nightmare for the companies that are making these products, because you've got to trace origin of a whole bunch of things, because it's not just chips at risk here. It's steel, it's aluminum, it'll be other things.
That's the thing. You got to think of this as the honest importer who wants to follow the law, and it's getting so confusing. So maybe we'll take a breath. Who knows?
Going to cost them a lot of money, and it's probably going to cost them more money than simply paying the tariffs themselves.
So my guess is there'll be more for the trade guys to talk about and relate to as this goes on. So
that gets to a variation of the third topic, which we probably don't have time for, but this is a never-ending story. And each week we do another chapter. But one of the things about these negotiations has been that they're never really over, and no matter what he does, it just asks and raises more questions. And then there has to be another round of, here are the questions, and another round of, here are the answers, which in turn raise more questions.
I guess we can call it there with many more questions, and hopefully we'll have some more answers next week.
Answers would be good. That's right. We're short on them right now.
We're good on the questions. We're not so good on the answers.
Always appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast. For more audio content, visit csis.org/podcast. Thanks for tuning in.